Hello everybody, my name is John Mark Johnson Jr. and I am the host of Reformed GGA, and I'm here to talk about a particular platform of gun that I kind of have a little bit of a love-hate relationship with, and that is the AR-15 platform. Now, this talk is not going to be about this specific AR-15, and yes, I could do a review on it, but I really haven't put a whole lot of rounds on this particular gun, and so I don't really want to review it until I get more rounds through it. But for those of you who are curious about this specific gun here, this is a Delton Echo 316H, and it is the version with the M-LOK furniture. That's where all the FDE stuff is, the M-LOK furniture. And in case you're wondering what the scope is, it also is not anything incredibly impressive. It's just a Vortex 4x12x40. That's all it is, the Crossfire 2. So not an overly complicated setup, not very fancy or anything like that. It's kind of just a beater gun for me. So far it works well enough for what I do with it. But like I said, I want to put a lot more rounds to it before I do a proper review. So what I'm talking about is just AR-15s in general, and this is the one that I happen to have to stand in for that category. And what I want to talk about is basically the reasons why I both love and hate the AR-15. And people who know me are sometimes very confused by the fact that I own an AR-15, because they know that a lot of the guns that I get are not AR-15s. In fact, the vast majority of them are not. But I still have had, and still have, obviously, AR-15 at least pattern guns. And so it's like, well, you kind of seem like you're against it sometimes, and then you go out and you buy them, so what's the deal? And to be fair, I mean, that I can understand where the confusion comes in, because the very first gun that I ever bought for myself was an AR-15 gun. It was in 22LR, so not a true AR-15, but it was still AR-15 platform. And actually, the very first shotgun that I bought for myself was also made to look like an AR-15. Obviously, it wasn't, because it was a shotgun, but still, it was made to look like an AR-15. And it really does get a lot of people wondering what exactly is going on there, because they also know that a lot of the other guns that I have are not AR-15s. In fact, the ones that I like the most, and the ones that I tend to rely on for self-defense purposes, home defense purposes the most, are not AR-15s. So what's the deal? You have bought them, you obviously own one true AR-15 and other guns that are of that platform. You've at least you do own and have owned in the past, but they aren't your primary go-to for home defense situations, and you don't seem to like them too terribly much. So what's going on there? Well, the basic explanation for this is that, well, I have kind of a complicated relationship with the AR-15 platform. There's lots of things that I do love and hate about it, and this is something that has actually gone on for a very long time in my life. It's kind of manifested more now that I've actually gotten into guns more. But my relationship with this platform of gun goes way, way back into my childhood. For those of you who don't know, I actually grew up in a military family. My dad was in the Air Force, and part of the time he was in the Air Force, he actually worked security details and things like that. And so he did stuff with a good number of different weapons, including the M16, which is basically the military version of the AR-15. Now, technically, yes, now in modern days, the M16 goes by a different moniker now. It's the M4, technically a little bit shorter, etc., etc. Now, depends on the branch that you're talking about in the particular unit and stuff like that, because there are different versions of it that the military uses in different parts of the military and different units within the military. So that can get a little complicated, to be sure. There are a lot of designations that actually can be used within the military, and lots of different configurations that can be. So trying to nail that down is actually relatively difficult. But as far as my relationship with it, a lot of it comes from the fact that my dad did use that platform fairly often. And so I grew up with it just kind of with the mentality that it was a tool that my dad used. And that's how we grew up viewing guns, is that they were tools. And we were always taught that what made the main difference was the user, not the tool. That is, when you bash your thumb with a hammer, the appropriate thing to do is not to blame the hammer for what happened. You blame the user. You need to learn how to use the hammer correctly. Okay. It's your fault, not the hammer's fault. It's a tool. You don't blame the tool. The tool is not morally culpable. You are. And that's how we grew up around tools like this. Is it something that has the potential to be deadly? Yes, it is. And it needs to be treated with proper respect because of that. And you need to make sure that you're using it correctly. But you are the user. You are the part that's morally culpable, not the device. There's a lot of people in modern America that could use that speech, just saying. But that's how I grew up around the gun. And so for me, the AR-15 platform, M16, M4, all the different designations that you can give it, I didn't grow up with it being something that was, overly scary or anything like that. It was a tool that my dad used, and understood that with proper respect and proper training, it could be used effectively and efficiently, and that it had its proper uses, and it was also something you need to make sure that you did not abuse. But that's all that we viewed it as, was just a tool, and it was a common tool that my dad used, and he liked it quite a bit, and that liking it kind of rubbed off onto us to a certain extent. Grew up familiar with it, and so the AR-15 is, to us, speaking for the people in my family, is a pretty familiar weapon system. And the overall ergonomics of it, and especially the controls, mag release, safety, the bolt stop, all those things, the placement of them, we just learned kind of by osmosis growing up. It's something that we all took in. And so when I think of the AR-15 and pretty much any guys that it comes in, I think of something that I'm very familiar with, and something that because I'm familiar with it, produces a certain amount of comfort. Knowing what to expect is nice a lot of times, and there's a reason why my very first firearm that I ever bought for myself was this kind of a platform. It had these same controls in the same places. That familiarity with it really does produce a lot of comfort, and it's nice to know where everything is and how everything works. And the AR-15 platform doesn't only have pretty decent ergonomics as far as button placement, but it's also nice because it's pretty easy to take apart. One main pin. You can take out the front pin too, and a lot of times when I clean it I do, but for what you actually need to do, you only need the back pin taken out, and you can get into the trigger pack and the hammer assembly pretty easily. Pull on the charging handle and the bolt comes out. All that's pretty easy. Buffer tube's pretty easy to get into. All those kinds of things, not overly difficult at all. Very easy to take apart, put back together. There is one part on the bolt assembly that I don't like. There's a little pin that you can take out, and those of you guys who are AR-15 guys, you know exactly what I'm talking about. There's part of the pin that holds in the firing pin that to me is just, it doesn't exactly produce confidence in me. It's not that I've ever had one break or anything like that, or seen one break or anything like that, but it basically looks like a hairpin, and it just, yeah, I will not say it's the most impressive part of the gun, but it's still very simple, easy to work with, easy to take apart, reassemble, all those kinds of things. Familiar with it. I knew what to expect with it. And growing up, I never really was into guns all that much. I was actually into airsoft there for quite a while. And the main reason for that is that airsoft guns, by comparison to real guns, are relatively cheap, $50 to $100. Can get you a pretty nice airsoft gun. The ammunition for it is also really cheap because it's just basically a tub of plastic pellets. That's all you need. And so they're cheap, relatively inexpensive. And another nice thing about airsoft is you could shoot it, competitively at other people and it not cause any serious harm. I grew up doing lots of fairly informal airsoft competitions with people, very similar to paintball competitions, except that, frankly, airsoft doesn't hurt as much as paintball does. I really like that. but yeah, I grew up doing those kinds of things, but I didn't really get into real firearms that much. And part of the reason was that I really wasn't a very good shot with real firearms, especially handguns. And my very poor experiences with handguns kind of turned me off to all other firearms. And so, yeah. And so while I was comfortable being around guns like the AR-15 and things like that, familiar with the system in that, and even when I did airsoft guns, a lot of times I would run airsoft guns that were shaped like AR-15s. Airsoft guns are great. You can get them shaped in in pretty much any shape you want to. They make airsoft guns that are shaped like MP5s and MP7s and M1 Garand airsoft guns, even all kinds of cool shapes. But significantly cheaper than real firearms, and of course do a whole lot less damage than real firearms did, and frankly I was better at shooting them than real firearms. Turns out I'm just really recoil sensitive, and that's something that mostly affects you on the handgun side, and most of the real firearms that I was exposed to were handguns, and I couldn't shoot them worth beans, and so I thought it was bad with all guns basically. Turns out that wasn't actually the case. I'm not absolutely terrible, but it takes a lot of training to get past recoil sensitivity, and you have to keep up on it, and that's the hard part. Yeah, you can get around it and all those kinds of things. At the time I didn't know all that though, but like I said, I grew up in a family that was military family, grew up around AR-15 pattern guns. When I did airsoft, I oftentimes used AR-15 pattern guns, and when I got my very first gun, it was little 22 LR thing, but it was still AR-15 pattern. It's because it was what I was used to, is what I was comfortable with. I knew where everything was. I knew how to take it apart, all those kinds of things. And today I still appreciate that about AR-15s. You know, when I hold one, my right hand just kind of knows where everything is. I've just grown up around the platform and used that platform, and that and just the ergonomics and everything is just very, very, very natural to me. I'm used to it. I know how it works. And like I said, also cleaning it and maintaining it and whatnot is not very difficult at all either. I'm used to the system. That's one of the things I do like about the AR-15 is I'm used to the system, comfortable. And then having gotten out into, you know, the real world of firearms a little bit more, you start realizing just how easy it is to get replacement parts for the AR-15. It is an old platform now. The AR-15 in its military guise as the M16 went into service in the Vietnam War. And so what was that, 1960s, and now it's, you know, 2019. And so 60 years almost, you know, 5 or 6 decades that the gun has been around, and it's definitely been around the civilian market around quite a bit as well. Of course, the semi-auto version instead of the full auto version that the military has, but in either realm, it's just been around for a long time. And so all the major companies have tooling for it. They all have their own version of the AR-15 to one extent or the other. At least most of them do. I don't think that Kel-Tec has any AR-15s out. They've always kind of done their own thing. Sometimes not particularly well, but they've always done their own thing. I'll give them credit for that. But a lot of the other companies will have some kind of AR-15 version that is out there, whether it be the Smith & Wesson MP15 or the Ruger 5.56 or various other companies, or Delton. A lot, I won't say all, but a lot of the major companies that are out there have an AR-15 or something that's AR-15-esque. You know, something that's close enough to be one. And so getting aftermarket parts for it is relatively easy, and this gun is a good example of just how much I rely on the secondary market. This gun, I fire these. This is Tula ammo, 223 steel case Tula ammo with a bimetal jacket. And that bimetal jacket actually is fairly important to what I'm talking about here. That bimetal jacket has a steel jacket with a very thin layer of either copper or zinc plated onto it. This kind of bullet is absolutely murder to this gun. It is very hard on the internals of this gun. The bimetal jacket, because it has steel in the jacket itself, ruins the rifling on a lot of guns. The fact that it is a steel casing means that the chamber on this gun is going to get dirtier faster than with brass case ammunition. And the fact that it is steel does tend to be hard on some of the internal components like the extractor and things like that. This kind of ammunition is hard on the gun. Now, I don't hand load any ammunition of my own, and the main reason for that is I travel around a lot, and hotel personnel tend to get a little concerned when they see you taking in, boxes of smokeless powder into your hotel room. So no, I don't hand load, because most of the time I'm not here to do it. I would have to take the stuff with me, which would be a pain. And if I did take the stuff with me, it's going to raise a lot of unnecessary questions, we'll say. So I don't. I usually get whatever's commercially available, and usually whatever is fairly cheap, commercially available stuff, and this is definitely fairly cheap. But it turns out that with the AR-15 being what it is, getting replacement parts that this kind of ammunition will wear out is actually relatively easy to do, and it's actually cheaper than firing the good stuff out of the gun. So if I fire the cheap ammo out of the gun all the time and just replace the barrel every 5,000 to 7,000 rounds along with the extractor and a few other key parts, it will be cheaper than running the original gun with the brass case ammo. If we're talking commercially available to commercially available stuff. That's actually pretty cool. That's how ubiquitous this platform is and how much of it is out there. They've been producing them for so much for so long that most of the parts are just relatively inexpensive, and it's not too hard to replace them. Either mechanically, it's just been around for long enough that everybody knows how to take them apart and put them back together. It's really easy to find instruction on how to do that. And then, like I said, everybody makes parts for them, barrels and bolt assemblies and upper receivers and lower receivers and buffer tubes and all those kinds of things. Everything, pretty much everything on these guns, you can find multiple manufacturers out there that are making stuff, and all very competitive with each other now, and therefore competitively priced. And it allows me to do things that I could not do with a lot of other guns, like fire really, really, really terrible ammunition through it that tears the gun up, and be able to replace the parts that it tears up for cheaper than what it would cost to run good ammunition through it. That's pretty stinking cool. So, parts that I love about it: I'm used to the manual of arms. I love that there's so much aftermarket support for it that allows me to do crazy things like run terrible ammo through it and still do it more cheaply than if I ran the good stuff through it, just because that's how cheap replacement parts are for it. There's lots to be said for the AR-15 platform in those regards. Very familiar gun, very easy to work on, very easy to take apart, put back together. Lots of things I really do love about it. But like I said, a lot of people who know me know that this is not my go-to firearm. Never been my go-to firearm, really. Yes, I've had AR-15 platform airsoft guns, and yeah, my dad worked with and on M16s pretty often when he was in the military. And even my first proper firearm was AR-15 platform, 22 LR, but AR-15 platform. So I'm definitely not opposed to them, but like I said, for home defense guns, these are not what I go for. And the reason for that is I don't like the handling characteristics. As far as something that, if I'm going out to shoot and I have a bench or something to rest it on, it's not bad and it's fun. And like I said, I'm used to it and all those things, get replacement parts for it, all that stuff, that's great. But if I actually have to move with the gun any considerable distance, or if I'm in, an end of the world kind of scenario without rule of law kind of scenario, this is not my go-to, and everybody who knows me knows that this is not what I would go to. There's lots of things about it that I do not like for having to move with it. And part of the difference is what has happened to the AR-15 over the years. When the AR-15 first came onto the scene, it was actually a very different beast from what you see today in a lot of guns. The AR-15 that Eugene Stone originally put forward for consideration for the military, and that's exactly what it was called. It was called the AR-15. That was the original model designation. It was a part of the Armalite company. That's where the AR and AR-15 comes from. And it was actually a division of an aircraft manufacturing company, interestingly enough. And so they specialized in lightweight parts and strange materials and those kinds of things. And when he was tasked with designing a gun, well, technically he wasn't the only person on it, but the main person on the team that designed the AR-15. When he was tasked with designing it, he wanted to make something that would be something that could fill a very important niche that the military needed to have filled. And that was something that was light enough to compete with a lot of the subguns that were out there, but heavy hitting enough that it could compete with a lot of the full-size rifles that were out there. So it was a gun that was meant to fulfill both roles. Light and easy to carry around, but hard enough hitting to compete with some of the big boys. So could it go quite as far as an M1 Garand could? No, it couldn't, but it could go far enough. Was it as light as some of the subguns that are out there, like the grease guns and whatnot? Sometimes not, but usually pretty close. As the AR-15 originally was designed, it was a 5.5 pound gun, which is really light, and frankly looks a lot different from a lot of modern AR-15s today. For one, it actually had a longer barrel than these, and than this particular model did. It was like a 18 or 20 inch barrel, I think it was 20 inch barrel, but it was a very, very thin barrel. A lot of times in the industry referred to as pencil barrel. Very thin pencil barrel that's kind of long and spindly. The cover on it, the handguard, extended almost the full length of the barrel, and it was very, very thin, very light material. It was called Bakelite. It was actually kind of brittle, but it was kind of an early experiment with polymers, and what it did is at least prove the concept, you know. And so it had a very thin, long barrel, had a very light handguard that came over it, and then of course in the original military version they would have a carry handle on the back side. And a lot of times in the very early version, it was actually built into the upper receiver. Nowadays, if you do the carry handle, it usually is something that screws onto the upper rail here. But in the early days, it was actually molded into the upper receiver. So you'd have the carry handle on there. There'd usually be a little sight aperture on the back end of it. But it was a very, very light weapon, and that's what it was designed to be. It was light, and the round that it fired, the 223, well, in the civilian version, the 223 Remington, but as per NATO spec, 5.56 NATO, but the round that it fired was an intermediate cartridge. It had a decent enough range, but it wasn't super great, but a decent enough range to compete with how a lot of the big guns were being used. But light enough weight in its original guise that it could compete with a lot of the subguns. So it was a real good intermediate kind of gun. And in that original form, there are a lot of really cool things that it could do, but I don't like where the AR-15 has gone, to be quite frank. This particular gun, this particular model right here, is extremely front heavy, and part of that is the fact that it has this really heavy optic on it. That's one of the things that's kind of bad about the Vortex optics, is they tend to be very heavy. So part of it is that, but a lot of it just has to do with the overall design, and a lot of it, the extra weight comes from the fact that this is a heavy profile barrel, which a lot of people in the civilian market want, because it helps increase the durability of the gun, especially if you're going to be doing rapid fire. And me, as a recreational shooter, I like to go out and fire a fairly large number of rounds if I can get them cheap enough and just have fun doing it. You know, kill lots of little paper targets. That's pretty much all I ever do. Yeah, a lot of my guns have a defensive capability. I can use them in a home defense scenario or self-defense scenario, but primarily what I do with them is I go out and shoot paper targets, and sometimes these little rubber ball targets that I have, but most of the time that's what I do, frankly. Nothing a whole lot more fancy than that. That's the reality of it. And if I'm, like I said, if I'm sitting at a bench and shooting it, it's okay. But picking up and moving with one of these things in their current form that you see for a lot of civilians is not overly pleasant. This gun, as it's configured right now, is about an 8.1 pound gun. And that's actually relatively light for a lot of people, a lot of civilian AR-15s. A lot of the folks that I know who have AR-15s as well, they will usually wind up with an AR-15 that weighs somewhere between 8 and 11 pounds. This one is at the bottom end of that scale, so this is actually one of the lighter ones that is out there. But a lot of times, 8 to 11 pounds is pretty common from what I've heard from most of the people that I actually know and can talk to who actually have AR-15s and see their AR-15s and whatnot. They're 8 to 11 pound guns for most of them. And there's a good number of them that are in the 9 to 10 range. And I don't like that, to be frankly honest. If I have an end of the world kind of scenario, you know, without rule of law kind of scenario, I don't like a gun that is this front heavy. I mean, seriously, this gun is easier. I'm not holding on to the back end at all. This gun is easier to hold by the front grip than it is by the rear grip. Okay, well, that's how forward heavy this is. And for a lot of civilian guns, that civilian AR-15s, that's also the case. Now, that wasn't as much the case in the original AR-15 design because it had that pencil barrel on it, and it also usually wouldn't include things like scopes and whatnot. It was an open sight system. This one does have the a very typical front sight on it, not that I'm actually using it. And by the way, for those of you who are wondering, no, the front sight does not mess with the sight picture of the scope at all. It's actually kind of nice that way, for those of you who are curious. But this is the configuration that it came in at the front sight post and all that. And like I said, this is kind of a beater gun, so I'm not going to mess with that. There are ways to lighten it up and take off that front sight post, of course, get a pencil barrel on it, things like that, and you can start getting back to Stoner's original design, and you can get back to something that's fairly lightweight. But as they're commonly sold today, heavy barrel. If you get one like this, it's not a free float barrel, you're often going to have that front post on there, and that definitely adds some weight. And then, of course, if you put any kind of an optic on it, odds are it's going to be fairly forward mounted, and it's going to be kind of make the gun fairly front heavy as well. And because of that, having to just simply shoulder and hold while standing, or even while sitting, if you don't have a support for it underneath, it gets to be pretty heavy. And like I said, it balances much easier on the front grip than it does on the back grip. And the problem with most people is that they're not strong in their offhand. Most people are much stronger with their dominant hand, and that's usually the one that they wind up using to pull the trigger, because that's where they have the most control. If you actually have to carry this thing for a prolonged period of time, though, it's your offhand that's going to take most of the burden. And what that's going to do is it's going to fatigue your offhand, and so when you actually do have to shoot, you're going to have the tendency to drop the gun a little bit when you shoot, because your offhand has become fatigued far more than it's used to. So if you have to carry it around for a long period of time, it's not a great gun. And like I said, in a without rule of law kind of scenario, end of the world kind of scenario, really bad things happen kind of scenario, the realities of possibly having to transport a gun by hand become a lot more immediate, and a gun that is going to wear out my hand in a way that I would not normally be used to. You're used to putting most of the strain on your dominant side. AR-15 puts in its modern guise, with it being as front heavy as it is, puts most of the strain on your offhand, and when it comes time to fire, it's going to make you inaccurate. And this is where people say, well, if you don't need to fire it immediately, you don't need to be holding it up all the time. And this is very true. You could, instead of holding it all the time, you could put it on a sling. But AR-15s do not tend to take slings overly well, especially compared to like your average hunting rifle. On your average hunting rifle, you don't have a lot of this. The trigger, of course, is built into the stock. It doesn't have a distinct handle that comes out. You usually don't have a foregrip on a normal hunting rifle. And of course, the magazine well is much smaller and much more in line with the gun. And so on a typical hunting rifle, you'll have the the strap come down and eventually get back down to the stock, and it'll wrap around that way. And because there won't be all these extra little bits in the way, you can just, throw it over your shoulder and you're good to go. AR-15 though, it has these extra little bits in the way. There's oftentimes 2 or at least 3 things that can get in the way of being able to just throw it over your shoulder and hold it easily. There's, of course, the handle, there's the magazine, and in my particular case, a forward grip. Okay, if you try to do a normal sling mount that comes down the bottom side of the gun, all of that extra stuff is really going to get in the way, and frankly, it's going to hurt. There's lots of extra things there that are going to jab and poke and do weird things there. And then the right side of the gun also has lots of little things that jab and can poke into you as well. It's not a flush fitting kind of gun. It's not flat at all. You have the forward assist, you have the case and deflector. Sometimes the bits from your scope will usually be on the dominant side, and so you'll have to deal with that as well. And so the right side of the gun isn't very good either. The only really good surface for carrying the gun is going to be on the left side, so you're going to need a sling that actually goes across the left side of the gun in order for it to be carryable for most people. And this particular gun, as well as the vast majority of guns that are out there on the market, are not actually set up for left side carry, which annoys me. You take a look at an AR-15 and it's pretty obvious that that is going to, and of course you're going to carry on the side with your optic. Even if you have open sights, you're still going to have some extra bits there that are going to be poking in weird places. It's pretty obvious that the only real good surface for convenient carry with this kind of a gun is going to be along that left side. The other side has pokey bits. Bottom side has pokey bits, the top side has pokey bits. It's basically just the left side that you can carry across, but most of the time you won't see good mounts that actually are left side. Now, there are things you can do with single point slings and all those things, I get it. There are ways around it, but usually not overly convenient, especially in a relatively stock gun like this one. This is kind of sort of more or less military issue-ish. But not overly convenient to carry. Now, in the original version of the AR-15, the barrel was considerably longer, usually wouldn't have a vertical grip on it, and so the sling point would usually be much further up on the gun, and what would happen is, since it was way up here, and you wouldn't have this bit in the way, and this cover would extend much further up, you would actually have a spot where all this could actually fit right underneath your shoulder, or right on the back side of it, and it was actually pretty convenient to carry, but in the modern form, not so much. And then, of course, one thing that I've heard from a lot of guys who are military guys who love the AR-15, they hold my AR-15 or any AR-15 if they haven't been to service for a while, and they'll comment on how stinking front heavy it is. Like I said, the scope on here doesn't help, but that heavy profile barrel, even for guys that have been in the military used to AR-15s, it still weighs a lot for them. Like I said, my dad, for example, when he picked up this particular gun, even though this is on the lighter side of the AR-15 range for civilians, like I said, most of the people that I know who own AR-15s, their guns weigh between 8 and 11 pounds, which is pretty heavy for a rifle. To put that in context, for hunting rifles, you usually want them to be between 7 and 8 pounds. These are usually 8 pounds and up. These do not make great hunting rifles, they really don't, just because of the overall weight factor if you get them in a more or less stock configuration. But my dad, who's a military guy, he picked it up and he commented on how front heavy it was. And a lot of the blame he put on the scope, and I know what the gun feels like without the scope, and it's not mostly the scope that does contribute, but most of it is that heavy profile barrel. But then there's another issue that happens with guys who got out of the military who like the AR-15. A lot of those guys, you're used to carrying this thing around all the time. And when you get used to carrying something around all the time, you develop the musculature to carry it. Like I said, if you're carrying it up or even at a low ready, still most of the weight is going to be in your offhand, whether you're carrying under the barrel or on a vertical grip, it's still going to be in your offhand. And if you're used to doing that day in, day out, you just get used to it. But after you've been out of the service for a while and you're not used to carrying the thing all the time, your musculature is going to return to a normal state, and for most people it's their dominant side that's going to be stronger. And so you pick this thing up and you hold it for very long, it starts to get really heavy just because your non-dominant side isn't used to that weight anymore. It's just the way it goes. And then there's a lot of people who, they say, oh, I love my AR-15, and I love that it has this nice adjustable stock, and so, it's really cool, and I can get good shots with it because it's fairly accurate. I'm going to take it hunting. And they go out and they experience the same thing. First of all, they try to put a sling on it, and they realize it's not overly comfortable because it does have lots of weird little bits that poke out and jab in weird places. And so that can create problems. Like I said, there are sling mounting options that can get you around it, but in a stock configuration gun, usually a little bit difficult. But after they get that issue taken care of, the other issue that they get out there is that if they have to hold on their animal that they're trying to shoot for a while, and sometimes certain hunters will wait for a really long time before getting the shot. And let's be honest, the 5.56 NATO or 223 Remington is not an overly powerful cartridge. Deer is about the biggest thing that you can really reliably take down with one of these things. It's actually more of a varmint cartridge. If you want to see a high percentage of one-shot stops, you're looking at something that's somewhere in between the size of a rock chuck and maybe a small wolf, maybe more so a coyote. That will result in pretty reliable one-shot stops. But you get bigger than that, and the reliability of one shot being able to put your target down starts to decrease. And once you get out of deer range, like mule deer, you can make it work for whitetail deer, but you start getting outside of that size range, not overly reliable. And so when you're hunting with this, and especially if you're doing it on one of the bigger animals that would be at kind of the limit of this thing's ability, like a deer, you're going to want to wait for a pretty decent shot. And for most people that either means a headshot, in which case you need to have a real good angle on the brain case, and the gun itself, depending on how you have it configured, if you have a free float barrel and things like that, can actually be accurate enough for that, especially, like I said, depending on the range and the particular configuration of the gun, and of course the ammo that you're using, those things. So with the right gun, right ammo, at the right range, yes, you can do a headshot. But for a lot of people, you wind up waiting for a really good shot on the vitals that you can be sure is going to get it through and through. And it can take a while. And so you're going to be holding there for a while. And your offhands, because it's the one that's going to be supporting the most of the weight of the gun, is going to start to get weaker and weaker and weaker, until you actually go to take the shot, and there's a real good chance you're going to dip. It has happened multiple times to multiple people, and they've come back and they've told me, I'm not a hunter, I don't go out and do that. But I have experienced the same phenomenon on the range. I'll be sitting at the bench with it and pop, 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 hit whatever you want, and then go and stand for a while, pop, 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 and then by the end of the standing session, the last few shots are sometimes really low, and it's because I keep dropping the barrel. That's just fatigue. It's the way it works. If you're a normal person and you're not carrying a gun that puts strain on your offhand side all the time, your dominant side is going to be your strong side, and your other side is just simply not going to be used to carrying things for long periods of time. So for me, I'm right-handed. Right hand goes around the gun, but it's not bearing most of the weight. My left hand is. And that's going to fatigue more quickly because I am right-handed and I don't carry things in my left hand all that often. It doesn't take too long to fatigue. And so after a while, usually within a half hour or so, my shots will start to drop. It doesn't take long. And so if I have to do a lot of trekking with a gun, I don't want it to be a gun with all the little sharp tidbits on it that an AR-15 has. And because this is a civilian version with the heavy profile barrel that makes it last real long by comparison, and helps you maintain consistent shot size and those kinds of things, which is all great, but it also makes the front end really heavy, and it means that if you have to freehand the thing for any period of time, either you're just doing shot after shot after shot like I do when I'm shooting paper targets, Or if you're out in the field and you're holding on a deer and waiting for it to turn around and look at you the right way, well, you're going to be holding there for a while, and if you don't have any kind of support on it, chances are by the time you get around to making the shot, you're going to drop a bit. It's just the way it is. So AR-15 has a lot of good things going for it. The battery of arms is something that I'm used to. It's easy to take apart. Aftermarket parts for it are amazingly easy to get and relatively cheap, so much so that I can fire the really junky ammo through it, replace the parts that need to be replaced at the point that this stuff will wind up damaging it. And that will be cheaper than getting really good ammunition and getting a really high-end gun to shoot through. That's actually really cool, and I like that about the platform. But the front heaviness of it and also all the weird little shapes make it something that I'm not going to just take with me and go out into the wilderness with, and not going to carry it for a long period of time. And then also on the issue of things I don't like, even though I am used to the battery of arms, the AR-15 has lots of buttons that work perpendicular to the plane of the gun. I've talked about this in other reviews. I don't like those because there's a good chance that you can bump them off. Like the magazine release, for example. Anything hits the side of the gun, it can cause the magazine to drop. And now this one does have a little bit of a fence around the magazine release to keep that from happening, so that hopefully if the object is wide enough, it'll hit part of that fencing and it won't press the magazine release, at least not all the way. That helps. But the magazine release, even though it's in a fairly convenient spot for being able to drop, it's also in a really bad spot as far as your index finger is concerned. Whenever you're holding a gun, you want to be able to have a resting spot for your index finger that is not in the trigger guard or on the trigger guard or anything like that. You always want to make sure that your trigger finger is well off the trigger until it's actually time to fire. Well, my trigger finger naturally rests right where the magazine release is, which means that either I have to find a different spot, and a lot of times I'll drop it a little bit, and that alleviates the problem to some extent, although it's pretty easy to bump one way or the other. Or if I leave it there and something happens to surprise me and I flinch, I'm going to clench with my hand, and it's going to wind up dropping the magazine. So let's say I went out hunting, and not that I do go hunting, but let's say I went out hunting and a rabbit jumped up in front of me. It's like, oh wow, it's there. And I react, oh wow, it's there. I just dropped my magazine while I'm trying to shoot my little rabbit. Hope I get him on that first shot, because there's going to be a second shot because all my rounds are in the dirt now. Not so good. And then of course the bolt release that is on the opposite side, when the bolt release is held back, it actually sticks out a little bit. Again, perpendicular to the plane of the gun. I don't like that. And I've done this a number of times with AR-15 and AR-15 guns. Is I'll get done shooting a string of fire, the bolt will lock back like it does, and then I'll place the gun with the left side down onto something, and I'll let it rest there, and of course it'll hit the bolt release, and the bolt will go flying home when I didn't intend it to. And most of the time my hand isn't anywhere near the ejection port, so it's not a big issue, but still sending it home when I didn't want it to is not good. So yeah, weird operations of the buttons I don't like. I've complained about that on multiple guns. You guys know that I don't like it. It's a relatively minor issue. You can work around it, but still it gets in the way and it is still annoying. Okay. So that is, well, that's my relationship with the AR-15. Lots of cool things about it, but the actual functioning dynamics of actually having to take it out into the field for a prolonged period of time, or even just hold it on target for a prolonged period of time, makes it rather unwieldy. And in its civilian guys, it's usually a pretty heavy gun. Like I said, most of the civilians that I know with ARs, their guns wind up weighing somewhere between 8 and 11 pounds, with a lot of them in the 9 to 10 pound range. 9 point something, 10 point something. That's pretty common. And so as far as my preferred gun to go out and get things done with when everything else goes wrong, I don't want a gun that's going to hold me back in those ways. I don't want a gun that puts a lot of strain on my off side. I don't want a gun that has buttons that operate in weird ways that can accidentally open and close things or drop things when you don't want them to be opened or closed or dropped. Not overly preferable. So my biggest complaints about the AR-15 is that it is front heavy, and the way that some of the buttons work, even though they're very easy to get to and very familiar ergonomically, because that's what I grew up with basically, they're still kind of potentially hazardous, and I don't like that about them. And like I said, not overly fun to carry at all. And as far as the commonly easily available versions of the AR-15 out there, they're not super travel friendly for me. They're not something that I can just stuff in my suitcase and go. They're a little bit too big for that. Now, they do make versions of the AR-15 that have a buffer tube that actually folds over, and I could technically take the muzzle device off, and that would give me a little bit of portability. But in their normal configuration, their lower end budget AR configuration, no, not so great that way. So what I usually do, as most of you guys do know, I stick with pistol caliber carbines. Ballistically, of course, they're not as good as a .223, but as far as handling characteristics are concerned, they tend to have much better handling characteristics, and it's one of those things that you have to weigh. If I have to hold on target for a while with something like an AR-15, let's say you have a home invader situation. Someone busts through the door, and you point the gun over at them, and you say, "Halt! Stop or I'll shoot." And they say, "Okay, I'm good." And you get on the line and you call the police, and while you're calling the police, you're going to have the gun pointed at them, and you're going to be holding them there for the police. And you're going to be holding it there, and you're going to be holding it there. And AR-15 is front heavy. Your offhand tends to get fatigued much faster than your dominant side does, which means that as you're holding it there, waiting for the police to show up, your gun's going to drop, and it's going to drop, and it's going to drop. And suppose he decides to get a wild hair and do something stupid and forces you to shoot, there's a pretty good chance you're going to drop your shot. And you could completely miss, depending on the distance, or you could wind up, hitting him, but in a non-lethal area, something like that, some kind of a gut shot or something like that, which still really hurt. It could definitely be lethal down the range, but it's not going to incapacitate him in the moment a lot of times. And so if he has a deadly weapon on him, for example, a knife or something like that, that he has managed to retain, or he had stuffed in his pocket that you didn't know about, and he decided to come out with it and attack you with it, and you're holding on him for, maybe 20 or 30 minutes waiting for the police to show up, and depending on where you live and how far out of town you are, 20 to 30 minutes for the police to show up is not unheard of, unfortunately. The police are usually at least minutes away, and like I said, depending on how far out of town you are, sometimes 20 to 30 minutes is not all that rare. And so if it gets to the point where you're still waiting for the police to show up and he decides to do something, he decides to pull a knife and come at you, yeah, there's a good chance that by that point you're going to be fatigued enough, you're going to drop your shot, hit him in a non-lethal spot, he keeps coming, you're dead. It's one of those trade-offs that you have to take. And me personally, I really would prefer to settle that kind of a conflict without firing a shot if I have to. If somebody barges in and I point the gun at them and say, "Stop or I'll shoot," and they stop, well, I'm not going to shoot them. Yeah, I'm going to hold them there for police as much as possible, and hopefully everybody walks away from the incident. Yeah, hopefully one guy is walking away in handcuffs, but hopefully everyone is still alive at the end of it. But at the same time, I'm not going to just see someone barging in and not give them a chance at all. Under law, and depending on the situation, that might not always be feasible to give the bad guy the option, but if it is available, I would like to give it to him, and I have to be prepared for that. If I do give him the option, am I prepared to actually see it through? Am I going to be able to hold the gun on him to keep him there for the police while making the phone call and doing all the other things that I need to do, and also make sure that I'm going to be able to hold him there for a while? With a gun like a civilian AR-15 that can weigh 8 to 11 pounds and be very front heavy because of heavy profile barrels and sometimes optics as well, Is that a great option for being able to do that? Not really. Not in my experience, at least. And from what I've heard from people who do try to take them hunting and things like that, where they actually have to sit on target for a while, freestanding, unsupported, doesn't work out very well. Then, like I said, if you have to actually take it into the field and walk anywhere with it, there's all kinds of pointy, weird angles and sizes and things on it that don't really lend itself to that. Like I said, the left side of the gun isn't bad, but the question is, do you have a mounting system that allow you to mount along the left side, or some other system? You know, there's single point sling attachments and things like that that can alleviate some of that. But you have to be used to it, and you have to train with it, and that really is the biggest issue, is are you holding this thing often enough? And when you're in the military and you train with it all the time, it's not such a big deal. Your body gets used to it, and it doesn't feel heavy anymore, and it doesn't feel awkward anymore. But you take yourself away from that kind of environment where you're not training with it all the time, and it's something you just occasionally have, you might not be able to do with it what you need it to do. And so that's why I prefer my pistol caliber carbines, like this CZ Scorpion, and as you can see, this one actually is loaded, because this is the one that is doing home defense duty right now as we speak. This is my home defense gun right now in this moment, and it is not front heavy at all. If I hold it with my offhand, it wants to fall back, which is exactly what I want. I want the weight to be balanced on my primary dominant hand, so that if I have to hold it on a bad guy for a while, I can hold it comfortably for a good long time. And at the end of that, if he decides to do something stupid, I don't have to worry about the gun dropping on me when I go to fire. It is going to do what I need it to do in that moment, and it's going to be able to be quite reliable in that moment. That's one of the biggest issues for me. Yes, pistol caliber carbines are less powerful in a round per round sense, but given the possibility of having to hold for a while, the pistol caliber carbine is going to be more accurate for me under those conditions. I just know myself. I don't train often enough with my non-dominant side in almost any regard for a gun that is front heavy to be workable for me. That's the main issue. And then, like I said, if I actually have to pack it out anywhere, all the awkward angles on AR-15 don't really like. This PC carbine, this is the Scorpion Eagle, you see that on either side of it, it's relatively flat. And the nice thing about it is that it actually has side mounting options, so that you can actually put the broadside towards your with great ease. Unlike the AR-15, that's, as it's set up right now, it's meant to go across the bottom of the gun, which has the handle and the magazine and the forward grip on it, which is not convenient to carry from. This one is actually set up for side carry. So if I had to grab a sling and walk out of here with this thing and go off into the wild blue yonder with it, this would be a lot easier to pack around and carry. And then also, because of the weight distribution, even though it's basically the same length as the other gun, especially if I put back on the compensator on the end of it, would basically be the same length, but this one has a little bit lighter barrel. It also does not just have as much metal up front, and it has a very heavy bolt that's on the back side. And so the weight distribution is a lot better. I can hold it with my dominant hand, which is not going to fatigue nearly as fast as my non-dominant side. I can make a call, do whatever I need to do while still maintaining sights on target, all those kinds of things, and not have to worry about significant drop or any of those kinds of issues. Okay, so that is why I don't like AR-15s for home defense, self-defense scenarios. If you get into a situation where you have to hold on someone for a prolonged period of time, there's a chance that you're going to fatigue yourself in a way that you're not anticipating, and it can be a major problem. I've known of actually several people now that have tried to hunt with AR-15s, and they wound up in positions where they had to do a freestanding hold on the targets, and it didn't present itself very well, and so they were waiting for the target to come around and present well, and in that period of time they managed to fatigue themselves enough that they dropped the shot, and in one case completely missed the target, in the other case hit it in a non-vital spot, wind up having to track it again and repeat the whole process to get a second shot in it and eventually take it out, which really prolongs the process for the animal. If you don't get a vital shot the first time, you're really dragging out the experience there for it, and that is not overly humane. But those same kinds of scenarios that happen in hunting can happen in real-world self-defensive situations. A lot of people think, okay, someone busts in the door, I just unload on them, and depending on the situation, that might be morally warranted, it might be legal, depending on the situation. But most of us aren't overly interested in killing people. Even those of us who have guns for self-defense, we're not overly interested in killing people. And what we would much rather do is say, stop or I'll shoot. I'm going to go ahead and call the police now. They're going to come and pick you up. And we don't want this person who has obvious harmful intent to get away, so we want to hold them there. The question is, do you have the tools to do that? And for a lot of people, based on what I've seen with my friends who go hunting and based on what I've seen when I go shooting with this thing, the AR-15 is not a good tool for that. In the initial moment that someone decides to bust through the door, yeah, very powerful rifle by comparison to a pistol caliber carbine. Okay, .223 that this thing shoots over the 9mm that my handgun shoots and that my pistol caliber carbine shoots, not much of a difference. .223 is going to win. But it's not just the bullet that makes the day. It's what's firing that bullet and how can you handle it. In the moment, yeah, turn, point, shoot, take care of the threat. But like I said, if you would rather not kill someone and rather just hold them for the police, do you have a gun that you can actually hold for 20 to 30 minutes, maybe even longer, on target without having to worry about significant droppage, fatigue, and those kinds of things? And for a lot of people, that's not an AR-15. Okay, that's one of the things that you will not hear on a lot of places that talk about the AR-15 for self-defense. And I'm not against using the AR-15 for self-defense, but be real about it. Okay, if you're going to use an AR-15 for self-defense, your ability to hold on target for a prolonged period of time from a standing, unsupported position is going to be limited. Just be aware of that. Okay, and if you release a dangerous suspect of saying, well, hey, stop or I'll shoot, and he stops, and you're sitting there thinking, I don't know how long I can keep this gun up. Police are taking a long time to get here, and you say, hey, get out of here, I'm done waiting. You might not want to tell them that you can't hold up the gun anymore, but you could be put in a situation where you're forced to release someone that you know is dangerous. And so there's issues on either side. There's the issue of, I don't want to kill someone, but I also don't want to release someone who's obviously very dangerous, possibly even lethal. It's one of those issues, and it has to be considered. And then, of course, like I said, as far as packing it out, an AR-15 is not fun to pack out for most civilians. If you're used to carrying it and you have a good sling setup and whatnot, it can reduce a lot of those issues, especially just the familiarity with it. If you go on, 15-mile hikes at least once a week carrying it around, yeah, you're going to be used to it. It might not be great, but you'll be used to it and not a big issue. But if it's something that you go to the range with and you pop a few shots, or you might go hunting with it, but you usually set up in one spot, have some kind of a hunting stick to put under it and whatnot. Then transitioning to an more active role, freestanding, active tracking kind of thing, it's not so great. AR-15 is a good platform, but for me, and also for a number of other shooters that I've seen, and also other hunters, not that I'm a hunter, but people who I've seen who are other than me who do hunt, the AR-15 is not really as ideal as a lot of people try to make it out to be. Self-defense, very powerful round. .223 is definitely more powerful than a handgun round, but if you get into a situation where you're holding on someone, not like to kill them, how long are you going to be able to keep that AR-15 on them versus another gun that isn't as front heavy? Something to consider. Yes, this is more powerful, but can it do what else you need it to do? Maybe not. And then for the hunting scenario, similar issue. If you are free holding this thing the entire time and you have to wait for a while for your target to present itself well, Are you going to get fatigued in your offhand because it's so front heavy? Then, like I said, it's not overly convenient to carry. There's all kinds of odd, weird things about it, and then there's multiple buttons on it that work perpendicular to the plane of the gun, and that's not good to deal with either. So there are things not to like about the AR-15. Now, does that keep me from owning one? Nope. And would that keep me from using, for recommending that other people use it for self-defense, provided they take those things into account? And they might say that, the chances of me having to hold on someone for a long period of time is pretty minimal, and so I'm going to ignore that one and go ahead and go with the AR-15. And if you decide that, the likelihood of that is fairly rare for you, that's your business. Go ahead and do that. But for me, I really like the option of not having to shoot someone if I don't have to. I would rather give the person the option if I have the time and the situation permits it. Sometimes you don't. You got to do what you got to do to protect yourself. But if you do have the time and the space for it, holding on someone, being able to make a call with your offhand, etc., is the better alternative, at least in my opinion. Anytime you can preserve human life, it at least deserves consideration. Even if that human life happens to be a scum bucket, at least give them the benefit of the doubt on that one. Now, if it happens to be, a wild animal that's charging at me, yeah, I'm going to take the option of shooting it as soon as I can. I don't care about animal life in the same way that I do human life. I'm biblical, historical Christian. That's not the way we think. Humans are created special. Humans are made in the image of God. And so we give a lot more consideration to human life and to preserving human life, even criminals, than we do animals. If an animal comes out and tries to attack us, yeah, that's not something that we're going to really hesitate about. Not that we want to see a painful death for an animal or something like that, but if the question is it's me or it's going to be it that dies. Humans, if it's me or it, and the other person's in the wrong, I'm still going to seek to preserve the life if I can, without putting myself in undue risk. And I feel that I'm better equipped to do that with a pistol caliber carbine because the weight is further back than with a typical AR-15. There are ways to get around it, okay, and you can redistribute the weight on an AR-15 to a certain extent. You can get some of the old military style buttstocks that they have that are metal, and they'll put a little bit more weight further back and redistribute that to a little bit better. And of course, you can train with it. Take it on that 15-mile hike, go out and do freestanding target shooting for an hour or two at a time. And if you do all that training and put all that time in, then yeah, you can make it work for you just fine. I guess you could also carry around a little hunting stick with you and just set up with it, if you get into that situation. I don't see that as particularly likely, but it's one of those things you're going to have to consider for yourself where you're going to come out on it. But I would encourage people to think about it. The AR-15's biggest downside, as far as I'm concerned, is that it is a front-heavy weapon system in its common civilian guise. Like I said, as it was originally designed, pencil barrel, and also much longer barrel, which gave you a better surface for putting in a sling and stuff like that. But in its normal civilian guise that it is now, usually fairly heavy front end, and that has a lot of ramifications that a lot of people don't think of until they actually start trying to pack this thing around, or until they wind up holding on a target for a prolonged period of time, and then they start realizing, wow, this really sucks, and then the AR-15 isn't so fun anymore. Okay, for people who are well trained, who do a lot of training with it, who are used to it and used to having that weight in their offhand, it's not a big issue. But the average civilian doesn't train enough for those kinds of things to be an advantage. And as I've said in other videos, for a home defense situation, a pistol caliber carbine might be a good option for you. Obviously, the round that an AR-15 shoots is going to be more powerful, and that does need to be considered as well. But depending on the situation, depending on the concerns, pistol caliber carbine, not all bad. But like I said, it wouldn't stop me from recommending an AR-15 to people. I'd rather that they have a gun that is powerful enough that they feel confident with it, and that's actually going to be the biggest issue, is what you feel confident with. Some people would not feel confident with this pistol caliber carbine that I have here. They would say, oh, 9mm sucks, and I've heard a lot of people say 9mm sucks, and a lot of them I have not seen them put forward substantial documentary evidence to say that it would be insufficient to the task, but a lot of them don't trust the 9mm round, even though out of a carbine it's going to be more powerful, and if you get the right kind of round, it can actually do a lot more than you think it would do. But a lot of people are just not going to be confident with this. And if you're not confident with whatever you're choosing for self-defense, well then, yeah, it's not going to work for you. And if it takes a intermediate rifle caliber round for you to be confident, well then, go ahead and do the AR-15. But like I said, my major consideration is if I am in a situation where I have to hold on someone for a prolonged period of time, the one gun that I do not want is my AR-15. I cannot hold for a prolonged period of time with it. And that's also inconvenient and awkwardly placed, and the buttons can be accidentally pressed and things like that. But the biggest thing is front heavy. If you have to hold in this particular spot for a long period of time freely and there's no bottom support, it's not so pleasant. Just saying. Anyways, thank you very much for your time and attention, for listening to me ramble about the AR-15. Bye-bye.